Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken journey into the shadows of the past. Whether you are listening as the night begins or as sleep gently approaches, I am grateful you've chosen to spend this time with me. Let me know in the comments, are you tuning in from a quiet, distant place, or from the heart of a bustling city winding down? And if these explorations bring you a sense of rest or reflection, please consider subscribing. There are countless more voices from history still waiting to be heard. Tonight, we step into a world that is both fascinating and deeply unsettling, a world where childhood was not a time of innocence, but a test of survival. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from 793 to 1066 AD, across what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, is often remembered for its legendary warriors, explorers, and traders. But behind the myths and the sagas lies a reality few dare to imagine: the brutal upbringing of Viking children. Despite the relentless hardship, these children grew into some of the most formidable and respected people in history. They reached the shores of America centuries before Columbus, struck fear into the hearts of European kingdoms, and built a civilization that endured for generations. But how did such harsh upbringings forge such legendary adults? And what can we learn from their story about resilience, trauma, and the true meaning of preparing children for the world? Tonight, I will take you inside the shocking world of Viking childhood, revealing the 7 most brutal realities these young ones faced every single day. What you are about to hear will forever change your perspective on childhood, parenting, and what it truly takes to survive. In the Viking world, a child's life was never guaranteed. When a baby was born, it was not automatically welcomed into the family. Instead, the newborn was placed on the ground before its father, who had to make a choice that would determine whether the child lived or died. If the father picked up the baby, the child was accepted. If he turned away, if the child was too weak, too sickly, or simply one mouth too many to feed, the baby would be left outside to die from exposure to the elements. This practice, known as exposure, was disturbingly common. Archaeological evidence reveals the remains of infants outside Viking settlements, buried without the ceremonies or grave goods that marked them as full members of the community. Sometimes, perfectly healthy babies were abandoned simply because they were girls, or because the family could not afford to feed another child during a harsh winter. For those who survived, the message was clear from the very beginning: your existence is conditional. You are here because you passed the first test, but more are coming. This knowledge shaped every aspect of a Viking child's life, creating a survival mentality that would define their world. From the moment they could walk, Viking children were expected to contribute to the family's survival. There was no room for a prolonged, protected childhood. By age 3 or 4, children were already working alongside adults in tasks essential for the family's survival. Little boys were sent out into the cold to tend sheep and cattle, armed with nothing but a stick and the knowledge that if they lost even one animal, their family might starve that winter. Little girls collected eggs from aggressive chickens, churned butter until their arms ached, and helped preserve meat and fish for the long, dark months ahead. Failure was not an option. If a modern child spills their juice, we clean it up and gently remind them to be more careful. If a Viking child made a mistake that cost the family food or resources, the consequences could be physical punishment, reduced food rations, or being excluded from the warmth of the fire. Archaeological records show the toll this labor took. The skeletal remains of Viking children reveal stress markers from heavy physical work, undernourishment, and repetitive manual labor. One haunting discovery in Norway found a 7-year-old child buried with fishing tools, their bones marked by the strain of long hours spent in cold water. Viking children were deliberately exposed to violence and death from the earliest possible age. not as something to be shielded from, but as something they needed to become comfortable with. They attended public executions, watched as criminals were hanged or beheaded, and participated in the slaughter of animals for food. They witnessed raids and battles, saw the wounded and dying brought back to their settlements, and helped tend to injuries that would traumatize modern doctors. This was not accidental exposure. It was deliberate conditioning, designed to prepare children for a world where violence was a daily reality. The psychological impact was profound. Viking children learned to suppress empathy, to view pain and death as natural parts of life, and to find satisfaction in inflicting violence on others. Some historians believe the infamous berserker rage of Viking warriors was, in part, a psychological response to the trauma of their violent upbringing. There were no schools in the Viking world, no teachers in the modern sense, no books or systematic lessons. Learning was a matter of survival, a relentless apprenticeship where every lesson was tied directly to staying alive. A Viking boy learned to read the sky for signs of an approaching storm, to recognize the tracks of wolves, to memorize the treacherous rocks that could shatter a ship. A Viking girl learned to calculate how much grain was needed to last through the winter, to measure out precious salt for preserving meat, to keep a careful count of dwindling food stores. Mistakes could be fatal. Miss the signs of a blizzard and you might freeze to death. Mistake a poisonous berry for a safe one, and you could kill yourself and others. The pressure to learn perfectly the first time was immense. Children's graves contain miniature versions of adult tools, tiny axes, small knives, fishing hooks sized for little hands. These were not toys. They were working instruments, worn smooth by use, proof that children as young as 5 or 6 were already proficient with potentially deadly implements. By age 6, Viking boys were receiving formal weapons training. They learned to use knives not just for food, but for finding the vulnerable spots on a human body. They practiced with spears, learning to throw them with deadly accuracy. They were taught to wield axes not just for chopping wood, but for splitting skulls. This was not play fighting. It was systematic, deliberate training in how to end human life efficiently. Children who showed fear, hesitation, or mercy were punished severely. They were forced to fight each other with real weapons, often resulting in serious injuries or even death. Before a Viking boy could be considered a man, he had to kill another human being, often in single combat, while his family and community watched. If he succeeded, he was celebrated. If he failed, he brought shame on his entire family. The trauma of forcing children to commit murder as a rite of passage cannot be overstated. These were children, some barely out of what we would call elementary school, being required to end human lives to prove their worth. Failure was not an option. If a modern child spills their juice, we clean it up and gently remind them to be more careful. If a Viking child made a mistake that cost the family food or resources, the consequences could be physical punishment, reduced food rations, or being excluded from the warmth of the fire. Archaeological records show the toll this labor took. The skeletal remains of Viking children reveal stress markers from heavy physical work, undernourishment, and repetitive manual labor. One haunting discovery in Norway found a 7-year-old child buried with fishing tools, their bones marked by the strain of long hours spent in cold water. Viking children were deliberately exposed to violence and death from the earliest possible age, not as something to be shielded from, but as something they needed to become comfortable with. They attended public executions, watched as criminals were hanged or beheaded, and participated in the slaughter of animals for food. They witnessed raids and battles, saw the wounded and dying brought back to their settlements, and help tend to injuries that would traumatize modern doctors. This was not accidental exposure. It was deliberate conditioning, designed to prepare children for a world where violence was a daily reality. The psychological impact was profound. Viking children learned to suppress empathy, to view pain and death as natural parts of life, and to find satisfaction in inflicting violence on others. Some historians believe the infamous berserker rage of Viking warriors was, in part, a psychological response to the trauma of their violent upbringing. There were no schools in the Viking world, no teachers in the modern sense, no books or systematic lessons. Learning was a matter of survival, a relentless apprenticeship where every lesson was tied directly to staying alive. Living under this constant threat of violent death shaped every aspect of how Viking children experienced the world. They could not form secure attachments, could not trust that their parents would protect them, could not believe that tomorrow would be like today. This uncertainty created a psychological state we might recognize today as chronic trauma. Despite these 7 brutal realities, Viking children didn't just survive, they thrived, at least by the standards of their own world. They grew up to become some of the most successful explorers, traders, and warriors in human history. They navigated by the stars across thousands of miles of open ocean, survived in conditions that would kill most modern adults, and maintained their courage in life or death situations that would paralyze people raised in our more protected environment. But this success came at a terrible cost. The Viking system produced individuals who were incredibly capable, but it also created a society built on trauma, violence, and the systematic suppression of empathy and compassion. Children who could not adapt, who were too weak, too kind, or simply unlucky were systematically excluded, starved, or sent on suicide missions to prove their worth. The survivors learned that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned through strength and violence, and that anyone who couldn't keep up deserved whatever happened to them. Over generations, this created a feedback loop. Each cohort of Viking children was slightly more hardened, slightly more cruel, slightly less capable of human compassion than the one before. The very process that was supposed to strengthen their society was actually warping it, creating people who were effective warriors but increasingly unable to function in peaceful situations. The psychological conditioning went even deeper. Children were taught to associate love with pain, care with cruelty, protection with violence. They learned to suppress their natural empathy, to see relationships in terms of dominance and submission, strength and weakness, predator and prey. They became a society that could only understand relationships through power, losing the ability to cooperate, compromise, or find peaceful solutions to conflict. This rigidity ultimately became one of the factors that led to the decline of Viking civilization. As the world around them changed, as other societies developed more sophisticated approaches to diplomacy, trade, and governance, the Vikings found themselves unable to adapt. They had been so thoroughly conditioned for violence that they could not function effectively in situations that required different skills. Viking society had a word for children who could not handle the brutality: soft, cowardly, a threat to the community's survival. Compassion was seen as contagious, a weakness that could spread and endanger everyone. Children who showed too much empathy, who refused to participate in violence, were not just shamed, they were often executed, starved, or exiled. Their families were ostracized, pressured to suppress any sign of kindness. This created a culture where even parents could not be trusted to protect their children. Love was always conditional, always secondary to the needs of the community. Siblings competed for resources and approval, sometimes to the point of violence. The absence of unconditional love meant that Viking children never developed a secure sense of self. Their worth was always tied to their usefulness, their ability to contribute, their performance. Children born with disabilities or who developed health problems were often killed or neglected to death. The archaeological record is filled with the remains of children who were buried alone, far from family graves, marked as unworthy even in death. Viking children were not just trained to be warriors, they were trained to be disposable. The highest honor was to die in battle. Living to old age was seen as shameful. Children were taught to plan for glorious deaths, not for long, productive lives. This death worship created a society that was incredibly effective in short-term, high-stakes situations, but almost incapable of building the stable, long-term institutions that civilizations require. The psychological impact of this was profound. Children could not form long-term attachments or goals. They lived in a constant state of urgency, knowing that any day could be their last. They could conquer but not hold. They could inspire fear but not loyalty. They could destroy but not create. The cycle of trauma was passed down through generations. Each new cohort of children was slightly more damaged, slightly less capable of human connection, slightly more dependent on violence as their primary means of interacting with the world. The long-term effects of this generational trauma can be seen in the historical record of Viking society's decline. The Vikings' inability to develop cooperative skills became increasingly problematic as their world became more complex and interconnected. As they encountered other societies that had learned to balance strength with compassion, individual achievement with collective welfare, they found themselves at a disadvantage. Their childhood conditioning had made them incredibly effective at conquest and destruction, but completely ineffective at the kind of governance, diplomacy, and social coordination that would have allowed them to maintain their conquests and build lasting institutions. The very qualities that made Viking children grow up to be effective warriors also made them incapable of building the kind of society that could survive and thrive over the long term. The trauma, the violence, the suppression of empathy, the conditional love, the constant competition, all of these created adults who were psychologically damaged in ways that made them unable to adapt to changing circumstances or develop new approaches when their old methods stopped working. As the medieval world became more sophisticated, as other societies developed more effective approaches to governance, trade, and diplomacy, the Vikings found themselves increasingly isolated and irrelevant. Their childhood conditioning had made them specialists in a type of warfare and lifestyle that was becoming obsolete. But it had also made them unable to learn new skills or adopt new approaches. The Viking example is both a warning and a challenge. It shows us what is possible when we expect more from children, and what can go wrong when we push them beyond their psychological limits. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing strength over kindness, effectiveness over empathy, short-term success over long-term sustainability. But it is also a reminder that children are far more capable and resilient than we often give them credit for. Sometimes, our desire to protect them from hardship might actually prevent them from developing the capabilities they will need to face real challenges in their own lives. Are we making our children too soft? Are we protecting them from challenges that would actually make them stronger? Or are we preparing them for a world that no longer exists, while failing to prepare them for the harsh realities they will actually face? The Viking approach certainly worked for their time and circumstances. But could we apply any of these lessons to modern child rearing without crossing ethical lines we are not willing? And perhaps most importantly, What does the success of Viking children tell us about human potential and what children are actually capable of when we expect more from them? The story of Viking childhood is ultimately a story about the choices that societies make about how to treat their most vulnerable members, and the long-term consequences of those choices. The Vikings chose fear, control, and violence, and they reaped a harvest of destruction that ultimately consumed their entire civilization. We still have time to choose differently. We can choose love over fear, cooperation over competition, and hope over despair. We can choose to see our children's natural empathy and creativity not as weaknesses to be eliminated, but as strengths to be nurtured and developed. The Viking children who suffered and died under their brutal system cannot be saved. But their story can still save us, if we have the wisdom to learn from it and the courage to choose a better path forward.